You've heard of kings who went mad and queens who were executed, but how many queens were buried in chains? This isn't just a metaphor, this is the real story of Queen Drahomíra, a woman who rose to power, ruled a kingdom, ordered a murder, and then paid for it with one of the most humiliating royal burials in history. Not cast out, not forgotten, but shackled as if her sins were too heavy for even the grave to carry. What kind of queen has her bones wrapped in iron? What kind of kingdom needs to punish its women long after death? And what exactly did she do to deserve such a fate? You won't find this tale in your history textbook, but it happened and its silence says everything. This is the untold tale of Queen Drahomíra, the queen who died in chains. In the 10th century, the heart of Europe was a volatile crossroads of pagan tradition, Christian conquest, and tribal power struggles. And into this storm stepped a young woman named Drahomíra, not as a victim, but as a queen in the making. She wasn't born to Bohemia. Drahomíra came from the Heavily tribe, a Slavic pagan people outside the Christianizing sphere of the Holy Roman Empire. Her marriage to Duke Rastislav I of Bohemia was more than a political alliance, it was a cultural gamble. Bohemia was teetering between its pagan roots and the rising influence of Christianity. Drahomíra was meant to bring strength, balance, and heirs. At first, she did. She bore Rastislav at least 6 children, including a son who would later become known as Wenceslaus. Yes, the same good King Wenceslaus sung about in Christmas carols, but royal life in Bohemia was no festive tale. As Duchess, Drahomíra quickly discovered that her foreign roots made her suspect. She spoke a different dialect, followed old Slavic customs, and was deeply distrusted by the growing Christian faction at court. Most dangerous of all was her mother-in-law, Saint Ludmila, a devout Christian widow who wielded enormous influence behind the throne. When Rastislav died in 921, Drahomíra was thrust into power as regent for her young son. This was no ceremonial position. She effectively ruled Bohemia, a land torn between competing nobles, shifting religious tides and the looming shadow of the empire to the west. To many, she was a stabilizing force. But to the Christian elite, she was a threat, a pagan queen with her hands on the levers of power. And Ludmila, the saint-in-waiting, was already guiding Wenceslaus down a different path, Christian, obedient, and loyal to the church. The stage was set for a quiet war, one fought not on battlefields but in whispered prayers and secret alliances. Drahomíra, the mother regent, and Ludmila, the spiritual matriarch, were locked in a cold, silent struggle for the soul of a kingdom, and in Bohemia, silence was often just the prelude to violence. But power in medieval Bohemia was never permanent, and soon, Drahomíra would be left alone in a kingdom where everyone suspected her. Queen Drahomíra had power, but not peace. She ruled as regent for her son Wenceslaus, but her authority was challenged at every turn. Bohemia was slipping away from her, and at the heart of that threat stood one woman, Saint Ludmila. Ludmila wasn't just her mother-in-law. She was a living legend, beloved by the Christian nobility, and seen as the rightful guardian of young Wenceslaus. Where Drahomíra was foreign and feared, Ludmila was native and sanctified, a walking relic in her own time. Behind the palace walls, a silent battle raged. Ludmila tutored Wenceslaus in Latin, Christian doctrine, and church loyalty. Drahomíra saw it all, saw her influence eroding day by day. Her son, her crown, her legacy, all slipping into the hands of the church, and then she made a decision. One of the most shocking political assassinations in medieval Europe wasn't carried out with swords in the open. It was done in shadows. Drahomíra allegedly sent 2 of her own retainers, Tana and Gaman, to Ludmila's residence. Under the cover of darkness, they crept into the old duchess's chambers. And there, as the story goes, they strangled her with her own scarf. No trial, no public disgrace. Just a quiet murder in the name of royal survival. Ludmila's death sent ripples through the kingdom. To the Christian elite, it was not just a murder, it was a martyrdom, and Drahomíra. She had killed a saint-in-waiting, worse, her grandmother. Imagine the optics, a queen mother killing the grandmother of her son to control him. A pagan woman silencing a Christian woman of prayer. The whispers turned to sermons, the nobles began turning, the church started recording. And Wenceslaus, was watching. At first, nothing changed. Drahomíra still held power. She was still the regent, but the walls were closing in. The assassination didn't stop the Christian faction, it empowered it. In death, Ludmila became invincible, her tomb became a shrine. Pilgrims whispered her name like a prayer. And her grandson, young Duke Wenceslaus, grew into a ruler with a mission to finish what Ludmila started. Over the next few years, Wenceslaus took back power, slowly, legally, and with growing church support. By the time he came of age, Drahomíra was isolated, her supporters gone, her reputation blackened. And then came the final fracture. Wenceslaus, the boy she raised, turned against her. According to chroniclers, he exiled her. Some say she fled the court voluntarily. Others claim she was forced out. There are darker versions still, that she was imprisoned in silence, watched but never seen. Either way, her reign ended not with fire, but with coldness. A mother cast aside. But her final punishment was still to come, not from the church, not from the nobles, but from history itself. Years later, when Drahomíra died, her burial was no ordinary royal affair. She was buried in chains, literally shackled in her grave. What message does that send? That even in death, she could not be trusted, that her crimes needed binding even in the afterlife. Some historians debate whether this was symbolic or literal. But medieval chroniclers agree on one thing: her burial was a punishment, not an honor. Imagine the image: a queen's body laid in the earth, iron wrapped around her wrists, her ankles, maybe even her neck. A woman once crowned and robed, now bound like a criminal. But killing a saint comes at a cost, and even for a queen, that cost would be eternal. Queen Drahomíra had gambled everything on her son, her influence, her power, her soul. But Wenceslaus, the boy she once protected, didn't grow into a mirror of her. He became her opposite. Raised between two worlds, his mother's ruthless pragmatism and his grandmother, Ludmila's Christian idealism, Wenceslaus chose the latter. When he finally took the throne, he ruled as a devout Christian monarch, humble and obedient to the church. But not his mother. Some say he never forgave her. Others say he simply feared her. But when she died, his decision was clear: she would be buried in chains. This wasn't symbolic justice. In medieval Bohemia, burial rites were sacred. To be buried in iron meant something deeply spiritual. It meant that the soul was still dangerous. It was an exorcism by soil. A royal execution that extended beyond death. The chroniclers do not give us a warm image of Drahomíra's final days. There was no dramatic trial, no public confession, no restoration. Just exile, silence, and eventually a cold grave lined with shame. Imagine the funeral: no weeping nobles, no hymns, no honor guards. Just whispers that she had killed a saint, that her sins had rotted into the very air, that chains were the only thing strong enough to hold her spirit down. But Wenceslaus didn't just bury her, he rewrote her. Under his rule, Ludmila was canonized, her name became holy. Statues were built, churches were raised. Pilgrims flocked to her grave, and Drahomíra, erased, condemned, the queen of chains. Here's the final irony: Wenceslaus himself would later be betrayed and murdered by his own brother. He too would become a saint. So in the end, the family that tore itself apart over religion, power, and loyalty was buried across generations, some as martyrs, some as monsters. And only one was buried in chains. History remembers queens in many ways: as saints, seductresses, martyrs. But Drahomíra is remembered differently, as the queen who had to be chained in death. Her story is more than just a tale of royal betrayal. It's a portrait of how power corrupts, how legacy is rewritten, and how women in history are punished not just for what they do, but for daring to rule at all. Drahomíra killed a saint, but she was also a mother, a ruler, and a woman fighting for survival in a world that had no place for her ambition. Her son became a saint. She became a warning. In the end, chains couldn't hold her memory down. She still haunts the margins of Bohemian history, not as a hero, not quite as a villain, but as a woman whose sins outlived her soul. And sometimes the most terrifying ghosts are the ones we bury in silence.